Warm welcome to this third and last webinar in this learning series of tools for circular business growth. The material and tools that we are presenting in these webinars can be used when you guide and advise companies on how they can apply circular business model principle for growth purposes. The webinars are organized in a collaboration with Nordic Innovation, Citra and Accenture, and are based on the Nordic Circular Economy Playbook and Toolkit, which is a digital toolkit for companies to transition to circular business models. And you can find the link to the playbook and the toolkit in the chat. My name is Sofia Forsberg, and I'm part of the Accenture Sustainability Strategy team in the Nordics. And I'm going to be the moderator in this session and looking forward in taking you through the next hour together with my colleagues. But the session will be recorded and can be found on Nordic Innovation's website after the session. And here you can see the team working on the project, both from Nordic Innovation and Accenture. And today's speakers will be Jenny Persson, who is an expert within industry ecosystem and has a background within sustainability and sustainable development through innovation and collaboration at Accenture. And Hanna Karlberg, who is a circular economy expert and working with technology, innovation, and sustainability at Accenture. So today I will start, if we go to the next slide, I will start by providing a quick recap and introduction to the Nordic Circular Economy Playbook, which is the framework and background for these webinars. And then I will introduce you to the cultural barriers that also can unlock new opportunity in an organization when pivoting to circular business models. Jenny Persson will then present what you should take into consideration when advising companies in building an ecosystem of partners to achieve full circular advantage. After that, Hanna Karlberg will take you through step-by-step hands-on exercises on how you can support other organizations or your own organization in identifying key actions and plan a roadmap of the transformation journey to implement the circular business models. And at the end, we will have a Q&A. So please be active and write your questions in the chat along the way, and we will try to answer as many as possible by the end. So if we move to the next, thank you. The methodology and tools used in the webinars are based on the Nordic Circular Economy Playbook. And the playbook combines circular methodology and know-how, practical examples, as well as applied tools and framework. And the playbook follows a 5-step approach, and each chapter addresses one of each step. We started with step 1 and 2 in the first webinar. And last week, we moved on to step 3 and 4. And these 2 webinars were recorded and can be found on the link posted in the chat. So if you missed that session, those sessions, you have the possibility to view them again. And finally, today we will introduce you to how to identify barriers and how to address them in a roadmap to transform to circular business models. And by the end of this session, you will have the tools to support organizations in identifying key actions for short and long term to overcome barriers and implement the company's circular opportunities. But before we get started with today's agenda, I just want to highlight the next step that we will have together with Nordic Innovation. So we are arranging a circular workshop program together with Nordic Innovation and Citra this fall. And this is a great next step for the organizations. The workshop continued to build on the previous program that was widely appreciated and gathered over 100 large and smaller organizations. So the program consists of 3 workshops where participants will get hands-on support, tools and frameworks to identify their role and prioritize pilot projects to engage in the circular economy ecosystem. And the training will be interactive, where the organization can work on their own company with participants from different parts of the value chain. And the workshop aimed to gather different types of actors in the value chain so that the possibilities and barriers and solutions can be discussed from different perspectives. And this also gives organizations a chance to meet other companies across the Nordics. And the program is directed not only towards large companies, but also towards smaller and medium enterprises. The program is free of charge, and it's a great opportunity to invite your network and the organizations into this workshop program. And you can find a link to this in the chat where you can register and learn some more, but don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions regarding this. So with this, let's move on to the first agenda point, which is circular barriers and enablers. So we typically see the transformation journey that an organization is going through when pivoting to a new business model as categorized into 3 phases. And when in development for a new business model, it overlaps with the organization's current business model. And it's important to illustrate this because often when you are transitioning, both business models exist in parallel, and it's really a journey moving from one to another business model with many challenges and barriers, but also with a huge amount of opportunity. So the first phase is being exploring and shaping. Starting from scratch, the organization should decide their circular vision and ideate what circular business models that can help them reach their vision, looking at what peers are doing, as well as looking at what the other industries are doing and apply that to their own organization to start ideating for new business models. And the organization can start experimenting in this phase by starting to collect data and insights and begin to form early hypotheses and by prototyping the concept to show if it's a viable initiative to undertake. And also in this phase, to explore who in the organization that needs to get on board. And when the organization has established a high-level concept and business model that they think might get them towards their goal, it's time to think about how the organization can get this out to the market. So what partnerships can get them there and what capabilities can unlock this in a meaningful way by accelerating it to the market, both in a pilot capacity, but also when thinking about scale. And here it's important to think about where it makes sense to buy or build own capabilities in the organization and also to find a partner. And in the attract and win phase, it's very important to iterate and test and experiment quickly to really think about how the organization can move to scale and how to scale fast. And this can be done maybe in certain regions or for one product or one component or scale for a certain target customer. And this gets us to the third phase, scale fast and keep growing. So thinking about how those business models can be adapted at scale and how the organization can move from a previous business model into a circular one and how the transformation can occur with the multidisciplinary teams, both internally and from an ecosystem perspective, working together to drive the impact at scale with speed. So this provides an overview of the transformation journey, and it also gives an overview how this webinar has been built up and the exercises. So in the first and second webinar, we presented exercises on how to develop a high-level concept and how to assess the capabilities needed. And today we are discussing what to think about when establishing an ecosystem of partners and what exercises that can support organizations in developing a roadmap to pilot and scale the developed concept. So if we could go, thank you. So if we're now double clicking on 2 barriers that also can unlock new opportunities. So people and culture, as well as ecosystem collaboration. People and culture are about how the organization is fostering the circular innovation mindset and how the organization is driving accountability and circular learning through the business. So there are three things here that interface across the patch, and with people being at the heart of the transformation journey for circular. So basically asking how the hearts and mind of the employees can be won on this agenda. So we see a huge rise of employees wanting to work for a purpose-led company, and the positive effect of where organizations give ownership to their employees to own some parts of the circular and innovation agenda. And there's a huge amount of positive feedback loops when it comes to employee retention and the development of solutions and ideating that enables companies to reach their circular business models. So there's a need for a mindset change internally at every level in a company. And it's important for the organization to incentivize the mindset shift towards circular and to keep it okay to test and learn during the transformation journey and encourage of sharing best principles within the organization rather than sharing best practices. So, for example, using the mindset of how the organization can take what has worked well and extract that principles at the heart of the concept and apply it somewhere else to fail fast and have resilience and great determination that ultimately can unlock some of the scale. And oftentimes there are siloed working groups in an organization, and it's important for the organization to think about how those silos break down and how the organization enable cross-functional teams that have a stake in this agenda. And how these employees can come together. So maybe it's through metrics or shared accountability or proper investments when thinking about how to drive people change. So I would like to hand over to Jenny Persson, industry ecosystem collaboration expert, and she will present how ecosystem collaboration can drive change in scale and unlock circular advantage. So warm welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Sophia. And I will try and dissect this very, very complex concept of ecosystem, which has really become a bit of a buzzword as partnerships were just some years ago. And I think I will focus on highlighting a couple of differences from traditional partnerships, and it's twofold. One is around the value consideration, which is building a little bit on what Sophia said, is around the mindset and the mind shift we need, what we consider value and who we consider value from. The second component, which differs from traditional partnerships, is the complexity of ecosystems and the complexity in the multitude of partners and the multitudes of relationships that often requires. So it's not something that you just put on and say, we're going to work in ecosystems. You need to really determine why and when. And the concept really centers around interdependence, and it stems from nature, and it applies similar principles applies to the business world, where we talk about interrelated activities among actors who are dependent on each other for a common vision and a common solution. And it sounds theoretically very nice, but it's also very complex to enact. And it's helpful sometimes to break it down and what the differences are in the different components. There are some shifts, which I know you've touched on briefly before, but if you look at what you're offering to the market or what organizations are offering to the markets, we see a strong shift from products and services, and particularly when it comes to circularity, where we focus on outcomes. And this is evident in industries such as, instead of producing a car, we now offer an outcome of mobility, for example. The objective, which is again deep diving on the mindset needed around value, we are very much stuck in a profit-driven system where we think about maximizing profits for oneself. Instead, we need to shift that value to also consider value to society and value to others. And that's easier said than done, but once you see the interrelatedness of a successful environment, you see the successful organization within it. The interactions, which I mentioned before, are probably the most difficult ones to shift from traditional partnerships to complex ecosystems, because now you are interdependent with not only one organization in a bilateral contract that can be steered by contract. Instead, you're moving into complex where you have multiple partners, multiple contracts, and multiple relationships that you need to manage, and you need to think carefully how that is done. And I see a big need in the research that I do that this is where organizations are requesting most of the help. How do you manage those interactions? How do you align the different activities to center around one value proposition? And solutions, I think you also have been talking a lot about the innovation needed to break out of the current trajectory when it comes to sustainability and circularity. So we see a lot of organizations moving from in-house R&D to opening up very central processes and core parts of their organizations to invite customers, suppliers, and even competitors into complex partnerships for innovation. And those shifts are hard sometimes to determine when and how you should and what you should do in-house contra do with partners. And the final one around the relationship is where the interactions and the relationship become important and less reliant on formal contracts and service level agreements. It now becomes very important to build the right relationships, to have a longer term trust-based base for your type of engagements. And these shifts are not possible to do if you only look inwards. So you need to look outwards to your suppliers, to your customers, even your competitors in how to manage these shifts. And often it's a need for what sometimes called for an orchestrator. And I think that's where it becomes important as an advisor or someone helping companies to sometimes take that role to help be the neutral part in the middle, to set an industry value proposition and then collect partners around it. So we can deep dive around that perhaps in a different section, but I think it's a key takeaway to take away. But if it's not the solution for everything, and if we jump to the next slide, please. I think it's useful to look at this as a transformation. When you think about circularity, you can focus very much on being circular internally, but even then you need a circular ecosystem, or you need an ecosystem internally with the different departments to become circular. You move on to products and services, you even extend that beyond the borders of the organization to when we talk about circular ecosystems of collaboration, where you look at industry shifts. Again, reflecting back to what I started with, it's a bit like nature. If you contribute to an industry, you also thrive in that industry. And it depends, of course, what organization you are and what objectives you have as an organization. But it's important to think not only to jump into an ecosystem, but to determine your role in that ecosystem and what you're hoping to achieve. But some key messages that I wanted to as a takeaway around that is not possible to achieve circularity or sustainability just looking inward. You need to look outward, or you will miss potential opportunities. With partners, you can also find a lot of untapped values, and your waste becomes someone else's value at the very basic point. But if you extend that to an industry perspective, you have the opportunity to create new standards, new shifts, etc., which are so much needed across industries. But you have been working with organizations already, and I would like to leave you with and to challenge yourself and to rethink a couple of points that are important in order to nudge us to the next level and to come up with innovative solutions. Reconsider who you partner with. So again, coming back to the mind shift needed. Who do you normally perhaps consider as a competitor, or you normally don't work with a small startup or an innovator? Reconsider who you partner with when you think about ecosystem value and extending that to an industry. Secondly, when you partner, what I most often see is that an organization will come up with a finished proposal and rethink how they will change the world with that proposal and then seek partners. Start earlier than that, and start bouncing ideas and start looking at problems already with partners to redefine that problem in a different context. What you partner on. This is critical. I think it's easy as ecosystem has become a buzzword and a trend. Everyone jumps into partnership. Reconsider. Think about what core things you want to partner on and what you want to keep in-house, and how you partner. Finally, working in a co-creation process and being generous with value. Rethinking how you contribute to other organizations. Rethink how you contribute to an industry. And I think that you need to balance the competition and gaining assets yourself with that generosity, and then start early is my final point. And I think just engaging in these types of webinars and with these organizations, which I know are participating in this program, I think you made a great start. And I will be available if you want to contact me for further questions or comments. But with that, I like to leave you with. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for illustrating and providing key takeaways and what to think about when shifting to an ecosystem collaboration. And as Jenny mentioned, we will add our contact information in the chat so that you can reach out if you have any further questions. So I would like to welcome Hanna Karlberg, a circular economy expert at Accenture, and Hanna will help you understand how you can use the exercises from the Playbook Toolkit to help organizations find what key actions that can help them enable the circular business models. And as you might know by now, Hanna has a lot of experience of being a facilitator in these exercises with multiple organizations. So please ask any relevant questions in the chat and we will take them by the end. So over to you, Hanna.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Sofia. We can actually jump to the next slide. And what we will do today is quite similar to the previous times. So we will follow the same kind of case example as we've done the two previous sessions. And that is basically to make it a bit easier to grasp the different kinds of exercises that we will walk through. But just a quick recap before we jump into the details. The case example that we have at hand, that is a large truck manufacturer providing transport solutions in the medium to heavy duty segment. And they are selling trucks, buses, truck components to business customers. And with that said, we will move to the next slide and the first part. So the first part of this final workshop is typically that the participants get an opportunity to share their homeworks from last time. And as a support for this, they have the business model canvas, which is the same canvas that they've had in the previous workshops, but that they now added some additional details to. And a really good way to start off this workshop is basically then that each of the participating organizations get to present or share this with the other participants, because that is also a good way to spark some collaboration and discussion between different organizations and companies. Here in this example, I would just like to remind ourselves also on what was the idea that we were working on. So for this case example, they want to consider circular packaging and basically increasing the usage of recycled material in packaging, as well as designing the packaging to maximize fill rates and the recovery of material. So a bit twofold there. And since last time, they have, as I think I mentioned, focus on those blue areas here on the business model canvas. And I won't go through them in details as there's quite a lot of text, but that is what they've done since last time. If we move on then to the next step. So basically circular business models, they do require identification, but also outlining a roadmap of key actions to plan the circular transformation journey. And some key questions then to ask is basically, the first one is related to identification of key actions that are to be implemented. And then a key question is, what are the key actions that we are required to make these opportunities that we look into, to make them happen? And that could be both in terms of culture, it could be in terms of ecosystem partners, financing, and also, okay, how do we actually avoid some quite common or typical pitfalls? The second part is related to key actions to close potential gaps. And then a good question to ask is basically, what barriers might you encounter when implementing these opportunities or initiatives? And that could be organizational or cultural, ecosystem related, or also financial. But also here it's important to think about, okay, but how can we actually mitigate them? And then finally, the third one here is related to ecosystem partnerships. And that is basically to ask yourself, okay, but who are the key partners that you need to collaborate with to make this happen? Because as we've been discussing quite a bit here, it is typically quite difficult to do everything yourself. There is usually somebody who can help or who has another good solution that some of the participants might even have not considered before. So if we move on to the next slide, we will now outline some exercises here from this third workshop. And the first one is related then to implementation barriers. And here as support, we have a template, a reflection template, which is basically outlining key barriers that are related to this circular transformation journey. And then participants also get those templates, but also sticky notes and a whiteboard for sharing. But the task is basically then to first work individually and use the template to assess the potential implementation barriers for the pilot idea. Then also to form groups around those ideas on the circular business model proximity. As we discussed last time, what we mean here is basically idea groups. So you have different kinds of companies or organizations sitting together and working on one idea. And then as a third step, also discussing those barriers and comment on the root causes. And then finally also sharing the most significant barrier and root cause to the full group. So again, as I think we've been discussing throughout the previous sessions as well, it's also very good that you discuss this in the full group, because then you can also tap into what other smaller groups have been discussing. And as I think also that I mentioned quite a few times now, here we have some suggested times for individual work, rearrangement into idea groups, discussion in those smaller groups, and then finally sharing in the bigger group. And I think those are good indication and a good guideline. But I mean, this will of course need to be adjusted or tailored to the cohort and the needs of that cohort. But typically this exercise should be quite quick. And if we move on to the next slide, the next step is basically related to culture change. And here we then want to continue working in those idea groups. We want the participants to use sticky notes and to also start writing down. The first part is related to values, mindsets, and behaviors that are relevant for the selected business model and circular pilot idea. We want them to evaluate the maturity of those aspects in the organization and also summarize key activities that are relevant for the organization with regards or with focus on culture change. And then we want to have a full group discussion on what activities that could be used to change the behaviors and mindsets for relevant functions. And I mean, of course, the overall purpose here is to actually make things happen, to spark change. Here again, we have a template, which we will soon look into. We typically use sticky notes and also some supporting materials to spark some more ideas, basically. And again, this is typically a quite quick area with time split in equal parts for the idea groups in separate working, and then also for a full group sharing. If we move on to the next slide, we have then some examples here. So this is the first template. And what you see here is then basically those yellow areas. They are supposed to denote some examples. So if we look at the second line here, we have as a value customer centricity. And then we see, okay, here for our organization, the maturity level, we see that that's partly lived somewhere in between. When it comes to mindset, a mindset here could be that every unmet request of a customer is a potential new solution. But here we see, okay, we're actually not as mature in this area, so a bit below basically. And then finally, when it comes to behaviors, an example is that we have dialogues with customers to explore unmet needs. And here again, the maturity level is not super high, but not super low, somewhere in between. And then if we move on to the next slide, what we do then is to write down planning and engagement related activities that are required to bridge the identified culture gaps in the organization. So on the left-hand side here, we want the participants to mark down the activities that are required for planning the culture change in the organization. And that could be identify change management lead champions in relevant departments, could be in design and procurement for this example. And on the right-hand side, we want them to list or outline key activities that are required for engaging the organization in the culture change. So here's more about engagement. And here one example could be starting internal communications around change program, organizing a kickoff event, and also conduct the engagement workshops. If we move on to the next slide, we also move on to the next exercise, which is more related to financing. And again, we have a template related to funding requirements. We are asking the participants to work in idea groups and basically reflect on what investments that will be required for the selected business model and also what amount of money is actually needed. And as you can see, and I think we've been touching a bit upon this before as well, but this is quite short time. So of course you will need to sort of deep dive and continue exploring the exact amount of money that is needed. But this is supposed to give an indication, basically, if it's small or if it's large, you can have some relative prioritization in the organization as well. Then also reflecting on what funding instruments are relevant and what funding sources that are relevant. And then jointly discuss the risks and mitigation strategies relevant to secure this funding. And if we move on to the next slide, we can actually look into how this template looks like or what it looks like and how it could be populated. So here we have made a check mark in the circular supplies business model area. And when it comes to the second line here, or the middle part, the number 2, which is basically then what are the funding requirements. The first part is related to what type of investments that will be required. And here one example is hiring and training of employees, and this one we have ticked, and also research and development. And then, as I mentioned before, we want to have an indication of what amount of money do you actually need. So here we have ticked one option as well. And then finally, what share would you need to be financed externally? And that is basically to add a percentage. And then when it comes to what funding instrument you would be appropriate for this cause, that could be a research grant. And when it comes to funding partners, that could be, for example, in this case, we have added Business Finland, but there's a lot of different partners there as well. And when it comes to then the right-hand side, and I think that is just important to emphasize as well, is basically that we try to also outline some activities that are required to finance this within the organization. I mean, the first part here is related to finance or finalizing the business case calculations, and that I think is really critical, and also applying for funding from whatever source that might be appropriate for this case. And if we move on to the next slide, we move on to the 4th exercise of this workshop. And that is related to identifying ecosystem partners. As before, we use a template, we use sticky notes, and also some supporting material on partner examples. And we have the participants working in idea groups and using the sticky notes to list key areas or activities where they would need support from external partners, also reflecting on the capability and technology assessment that they've made. Then we asked them to list present partners that could support with the identified areas or activities, and also potential new partners that could do the same. And then we asked them to write down actions or contributions required to get the required support from existing partners, and the same thing for new partnerships. And if we move on to the next slide, I think what I just said will make a lot more sense. So basically, what we see here now is this template that I was referring to. And what we have the participant do is basically to start in the middle and then work towards the corners. So we start here in the middle with the part that is marked with 1, which is to list key areas or activities where you would need support from external partners. And here, as an example, we have listed that we would need support when it comes to redesign of packaging products, material supply, take back of material at end of life, incentives for customers to recycle products material. And then we work towards the left here to 2A, which is listing existing partners that could support with the identified areas or activities. And then we have a company here, company A, a current material provider, started to investigate in recycled material, and company B, which is more of an R&D company. And then we can continue working towards the left here, which is then what activities are required to get support from the current partners. And here that could be, as an example, then to request prototype material for testing and offer from company A, and book a meeting with company B to discuss potential joint collaboration for development of new materials. And when we'll look to the right-hand side and the 2B, which is to list new partners that could support with the identified areas or activities, we have another company, company C, an R&D organization that is researching on sustainable, circular and recycled material for packaging and design. And we have company D, recycling company, that potentially could provide with recycled input material. And then we ask ourselves, or the participants ask themselves, what activities are required to establish a partnership with the identified partners? The first step here is to book a meeting with company C and request input based on their design knowledge and request a prototype for testing. And also to book a meeting with company D, discuss how they could incentivize customers to recycle material and request prototype material for testing. So it's in this kind of level and area that we want to go here with this exercise. And if we move on to the next slide, we move on to the roadmap development. And this is where it typically gets really interesting. So what we do here is that we use sticky notes to outline the first approximately or roughly 6 months transformation roadmap for the circular pilot that the participants have been working on. We want them to list 3 to 5 key activities required to get started, and if possible, define functional and activity owners, and also determine critical milestones and their timing. So we really want to try to be as concrete here as we can. And as input, we have the activities that we've identified in the prior exercises. So we can basically take those sticky notes and reuse them or write new ones, of course. But then we also have a template, a roadmap development template with a list of activities and also responsibilities and timing, and an example which is basically pre-populated to make it a bit easier to work with and understand. This is typically something that you could spend quite some time in, but here again, we want to be quite quick to also get some ideas and get going a bit. So in the workshop, we spend typically 50 minutes in the idea groups per company, and also sharing for 15 minutes with the full group. And then we really try to say, okay, but if you, one thing, if you're going to get started on Monday, what is that? So we try to be as concrete as possible. And that could be big or small, but one thing that you will do when you leave here, basically. And if we move to the next slide, I won't go through all these examples in regards of time, but what we have here is basically a list of key activities with an estimate of required time to make it happen, and also key milestones to the right. And if we move on to the next slide, that is pretty similar, but then here we have for ecosystem and finance, and on the previous slide it was related to technologies, as we discussed before, capabilities and culture. And if we move on to the next slide, we will see an overview of what the roadmap could look like if using this template then. And what we have here is then basically responsibilities and timings outlined. And the first part, which is basically the focus then in this workshop, is the first 6 months. But here the participants can also define their own timeline. So where you see that it says 6 months, that could be 3 months or it could be 18 months. But we try to make it a bit more short term here in the beginning. And then here we have, for example, function 1, which is design and R&D. And then a key activity here is to establish a partnership agreement with R&D redesign company. So that could be one thing to get started. And then if we move on to the next slide, it's also important to get things going, as I've been saying quite a few times now, but that we also have some immediate next steps after this workshop series. So then we recommend the participants to finalizing the roadmap and start implementing the activities. And therefore it is important that we try to be as concrete as possible when defining the activities. So the first thing is basically, as I mentioned, to finalize the transformation roadmap and validate it within the organization and the ecosystem partners that have started to come together, and also to begin implementing the activities according to this plan, and also monitoring and manage the execution performance along the way, because that is also important to gain some momentum, but also some stability and perseverance, so you don't just start and not finish, so you can get from A to B basically. And then we of course provide the participants with some materials and tools to support them when moving forward. We have the circular economy playbook, which is super useful, all the workshop materials and methodologies, and also the different tools, templates, and exercises. So that is a little package that we leave the participants with as to get started, basically. And then if we move on, I think it's time for Sofia again and a Q&A.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for walking us through these exercises and how organizations can identify the key actions to plan the piloting and the implementation of the circular business models. So before we move on to some questions from the chat, I want you all to open menti.com, and the link is sent in the chat, and then enter the code that you can see in the on the screen. And the question that we would like you to answer is how you will use today's lesson as well as the previous webinars to accelerate the circular economy shift. And this is a quite broad question, but I just would like you to answer whatever pops into your mind. And when we are getting some answers here, I would like to ask Hanna to comment. So let's see, I know that there are a bit of delay, so I'm assuming that some questions will start to pop up pretty soon, or some answers. So that's good. We got the first answer here, that one would learn how to drive the exercises and invite some of the organizations in their network. And I hope that they will do these exercises with them. So please, Hanna, if you have any comments to the answers are starting to roll in.
Yes, no, but it sounds like a good start, and also the second one there related to registering for the workshop after the summer. I think that's a very good first step, or a second step, and also just to sort of be part of that, because I think it's very, very valuable to be a bunch of different organizations in those workshops. Discussions are typically much more interesting then as well.
And it's very nice to hear that you have broadened your toolbox, and that you feel that you can use these exercises. And if you have any questions or any follow-up questions regarding the exercises, just reach out to us. But there are a lot of information that you can reach on the Nordic Innovations website that we posted a link to previously to the toolkit. But I think this is really good answers, to share the resources with members and to use different parts of it in a facilitating internally and external. Yeah, that sounds really good. So thank you for, I hope that some answers will continue to come in, but let's move on to a Q&A. And I see that we have received a question that we actually received a similar question the last time, but I think it's an important one, so let's bring it up again. And it is, do you have any tips on how to keep working with this methodology after the workshops? And I can start by directing it to you, Hanna, and then let's maybe Jenny have some insights regarding ecosystem partnerships.
Yes, and I think, of course, or I think as we've been discussing before as well, I think the most important thing is basically to get started, and perhaps not being too overambitious, but actually start with something quite concrete to make it happen. And then, as we've been discussing a bit before, and especially in the first of those 3 webinars, the value case to also prove it within the organization. So you can actually say that this is not just super good from a bunch of different aspects, but it also makes sense from a business rationale. So I think that is important. And then also, if you talk about those different workshops, it's also very good to have a mixed kind of team, and also secure that you have members to this team with the mandate to actually drive the change. So basically start small and then scale and so on, but also ensure that you bring the right people onto it. And that, of course, could also change as you progress with what you're doing.
Do you have anything to add there, Jenny, regarding ecosystem partnership?
Well, I do, and I think I can only second what Hanna is saying, is start small. You don't have to have your whole ecosystem planned out. It's more important that you start talking to your customers and your suppliers and your industry actors with the lens of potentially doing something together. So it could be an informal understanding how they view problems and understanding building those relationships, which could evolve into partnerships. So it doesn't have to be super structured, but rather super structured in daring to take those contacts and starting to progress dialogues. I think would be the concrete next steps.
Yeah, I agree with you both, and I think really good answers. So before we end this session, I would like to highlight and market the Circular Workshops program again, and maybe we can put it up in on the screen. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar session, we are arranging together with Nordic Innovation workshop program series this fall, consisting of 3 workshops where participants will get hands-on support and tools and framework to identify the role and prioritized pilot project to engage in the circular economy ecosystem. And the program starts with a kickoff in late August, and the workshops starts in September, following with 1 workshop every 3rd week. So you can find a link. We have published some in the chat if you want to learn more about these workshop programs and if you want to register. So this is a great opportunity to invite your networks and organizations to continue working with circular economy. And I would now like to round up this session and this webinar series that we have arranged together with Nordic Innovation and Citra. So a big thanks to our collaborators, Citra and Nordic Innovation. And thanks to our speakers, and special thanks to you who have participated and asking questions and been interactive in this session. So you're more than welcome to contact us who has been presenting in this webinar, and the contact information can be found in the chat. And don't hesitate if you have any questions regarding the workshops that we are hosting this fall. So thank you very much. Bye.